Currency Wars, The Making of the Next Global Crisis. Written by James Rickards. Summarized by detailed book Summaries. Don't forget to subscribe. Chapter 1. Pre-War. Imagine sitting in a sealed room deep inside a government facility. No windows, no phones, no access to the outside world. The air feels dense with tension, as though something monumental is about to happen, but no one's quite sure what. Around you are top economists, CIA analysts, Wall Street veterans, and military strategists. You're not at a battlefield. You're at a war game. But this war isn't about bullets or bombs. It's about money, and how it could be turned into a weapon of mass destruction. Now pause for a second. We've grown up thinking of war as something loud, violent, and physical. Tanks roll in. Missiles FOY. Soldiers are deployed. But what if there was a new kind of war? One where no blood is spilled, yet entire economies collapse, currencies implode, and nations are brought to their knees without a single shot fired. That's the question James Rickards forces us to confront in Currency Wars. And in Chapter 1, he doesn't just introduce the concept, he puts you right at the center of it. He begins not with theory, but with action. A top-secret financial war game, orchestrated by none other than the United States Department of Defense. It wasn't a movie. It wasn't a game in the playful sense. It was a real simulation designed to test just how vulnerable the U.S. economy was to financial warfare. And as it turns out, the answer was chilling. So, let me ask you, what happens when the very systems we rely on, markets, banks, trade networks, become weapons in the hands of our adversaries? How do you defend a country when its enemies don't aim guns at soldiers, but algorithms at stock exchanges and gold reserves? In a world increasingly shaped by digital transactions, global trade, and interconnected financial systems, this isn't science fiction. It's the battlefield of today. Rickards begins a chapter by pulling back the curtain on a simulation that took place at the Warfare Analysis Laboratory, nestled within the Applied Physics Lab of Johns Hopkins University. The location itself feels like something out of a spy novel, remote, secure, intentionally cut off from the outside world. Why? Because what was about to unfold could reveal the soft underbelly of America's financial power. The participants were divided into teams, each representing a different nation or financial interest: China, Russia, Iran, hedge funds, sovereign wealth funds, and of course, the United States. But these weren't just role-playing students or board bureaucrats. These were real experts, think tank veterans, financial analysts, people who actually move money on a global scale. And their mission? To test how global financial systems could be manipulated or weaponized during a time of economic or geopolitical conflict. What's fascinating is that the simulation didn't use tanks or troops. It used currency manipulation, derivatives, gold purchases, cyber attacks on financial infrastructure, and capital F load disruptions. In other words, tools that are readily available to nation-states today. And here's the kicker. While most Americans go about their daily lives assuming their economy is strong, protected, and secure, this simulation showed just how easily it could all unravel. All it takes is one weak point, one malicious move, or one domino to fall. Rickards invites us to reimagine what power looks like in the 21st century. It's no longer about who has the biggest army. It's about who controls the money, who controls the information, and who can strike first in invisible war finance. And this isn't theoretical musing. This is already happening. Think about it. We've seen economic sanctions used as a political weapon. We've witnessed massive stock market crashes triggered by algorithmic trading gone rogue. We've seen the rise of cyber attacks on banks and financial systems. Nations no longer need to drop bombs to inflict pain. They just need to destabilize your currency, crash your markets, or restrict your access to global capital. And the scariest part? The average citizen has no idea it's even happening until it's too late. This is a world Rickards wants us to wake up to. In this opening chapter, the focus isn't just on the war game itself, but on how unprepared the United States, and by extension many global economies, are for this new type of conflict. Traditional military institutions, Rickards argues, are still stuck in a 20th century mindset. They're ready for tanks and missiles, but they're not ready for quantitative easing as an act of aggression or sovereign wealth funds being weaponized by rival nations. And this isn't just a critique of military thinking. It's a critique of economic arrogance. The assumption that because the US dollar is the world's reserve currency, it will always remain safe, dominant, and untouchable. But history tells us otherwise. The British pound once held that same power, and then it fell. Fast. Currencies rise and they fall, and the institutions built around them can crumble, too. The war game was meant to test theoretical scenarios, but what it uncovered was real fragility. Fragility in assumptions, fragility in systems, fragility in leadership, and above all, a dangerous overconfidence in the idea that it can't happen here. So here we are, at the start of a book about wars most people don't even know exist. You might be wondering, what came out of that simulation? Did the Pentagon change its strategies? Did Wall Street take notice? Or did the findings get buried under a pile of bureaucratic reports, filed away in some classified archive? More importantly, what does this mean for the rest of us? For everyday people, for investors, for citizens who rely on the strength of their currency to buy groceries, save for retirement, or pay off student loans. That's the tension Rickards builds as he closes the opening act of this chapter. He doesn't give us the answers right away. Instead, he leaves us with a sobering realization. We are already in the pre-war phase. The battlefield has been mapped. The strategies are being tested. The players are positioning themselves. The question now is not if a currency war will happen. It's when, how, and who will win. And just like that, the chapter opens a door to a new way of seeing the world, not as a peaceful global village, but as a delicate network of financial power games, hidden from view, yet capable of reshaping everything we know about security, sovereignty, and survival. Let's step into the heart of the simulation now. The actual financial war game that James Rickards participated in. And let me tell you, this wasn't your average tabletop strategy exercise. This was real stakes, real experts, real scenarios that mirrored the power dynamics and vulnerabilities of the global economy. And it all happened behind tightly controlled security doors at the Warfare Analysis Laboratory in Laurel, Maryland. The Pentagon didn't choose this facility randomly. It was built for high-level war simulations, the kind where the fates of nations are tested, debated, and occasionally redesigned. But here's the twist. This time, there were no tanks, drones, or missiles. No enemy soldiers on a battlefield. Instead, the weapons were currencies, commodities, derivatives, and economic policy tools. Each team represented a global player: China, Russia, Iran, the United States, and even black swan actors like rogue hedge funds. The idea was to simulate a global financial conflict, where each participant had to protect their national interests while testing the vulnerabilities of others. Rickards was on the team representing the United States. And as the game began, the intensity of it all became clear. It wasn't just a theoretical drill. It was a stress test of the entire financial architecture that the modern world rests on. And guess what? The system didn't hold up well. One of the most startling discoveries was just how fragile the US dollar-based system really is. The players quickly realized that manipulating currency markets, launching surprise gold purchases, or restricting access to key financial infrastructure could cause devastating ripple effects. Not in years, but in days, even hours. For example, imagine this. China suddenly dumps a significant portion of its U.S. Treasury holdings on the open market. At the same time, Russia and Iran shift their reserves into gold and euros, while coordinating a cyber attack on SWIFT, the global messaging system for international banking. This isn't a Marvel-style supervillain plot. It's a scenario that was actively played out in the simulation, and the results were unsettling. The US dollar plunged in value. Equity markets were paralyzed. Confidence in the American financial system was shaken to the core. And all of this happened without a single physical confrontation. It was economic destabilization through financial jiu-jitsu, using the strength of the system against itself. And here's where things get even more sobering. When you think of warfare, you often think of cyber attacks, right? Hacking into a country's defense system, shutting down power grids, crashing government websites. That's the modern threat we're conditioned to fear. But Rickards makes a powerful point. Financial manipulation is even more insidious than cyber warfare because it doesn't just disrupt, it undermines trust. Trust is a foundation of any economy. You trust that your money holds value, that your bank is solvent, that your pension fund won't vanish overnight. But once that trust is broken, even slightly, it's incredibly hard to rebuild. And currency wars target that exact fault line. So, how do nations wage this kind of war? Let's break it down in simple terms. Gold, for instance, isn't just a shiny metal. It's a timeless symbol of value. In a currency war, one country could start buying up massive amounts of gold, quietly, stealthily, signaling to the market that they no longer trust fiat currencies like the US dollar. That alone could trigger a flight to hard assets, sending currencies spiraling and causing panic in capital markets. Or consider oil. A country like Russia could shift its oil contracts to euros or yuan instead of dollars. This would undermine the petrodollar system, which has kept the US dollar dominant for decades. Once oil no longer trades in dollars, the demand for dollars globally could collapse. Then there are sovereign wealth funds, massive pools of state-controlled capital, often in the trillions. These funds could redirect investments away from U.S. assets, move money offshore, or flood a market to cause volatility. When used strategically, sovereign wealth isn't just an investment tool. It becomes a weapon of influence. Rickards describes this with a vivid analogy. Imagine the global financial system as a circulatory system, pumping money, our economic lifeblood, through veins of trade, banking, and credit. A financial attack is like injecting poison into that system. It doesn't kill instantly, but spreads quickly, silently, disrupting organs one by one until the whole body collapses. And that's the nightmare scenario the war game revealed. The participants also noted just how unprepared the United States was for this kind of attack. Military defenses? Yes, world-class. Cybersecurity? Improving. But financial defense? Practically non-existent. There's no financial Pentagon, no currency version of NORAD, and yet the threat is very real and potentially more damaging than any conventional military strike. What shocked Rickards most was not just the outcomes of the game, but the complacency he saw outside of it. The broader financial and political leadership still seemed to operate under the assumption that the dollar would always be king, that financial markets could always be managed, and that foreign governments wouldn't dare weaponize the very system that makes global capitalism possible. But history doesn't support that kind of naivety. Currency wars have happened before. In the 1930s, in the 1970s, and they're happening now. The difference is that today's financial systems are far more complex, interconnected, and leveraged. That means the consequences of failure are exponentially higher. So what's the takeaway? If you're picturing financial warfare as some niche topic for Wall Street insiders, think again. This is about your savings account, your job, your access to affordable goods, your nation's sovereignty. And the scariest part is this. The war has already begun. We just haven't realized it yet because the battles are being fought in code, currency flows, and quiet backroom trades. Rickards closes this section with an unspoken warning, a kind of mental whisper that sticks with you. The next great conflict won't be televised. It'll be digitized. You won't see it coming. But when it hits, you'll feel in your bank account, your retirement plan, your grocery bill, and your nation's standing in the world. And that brings us to the deeper question. If a simulation can so easily reveal our weaknesses, what does that say about the reality we're living in? And if currency is now a weapon, who are the real warriors? And are they already choosing sides? So, what exactly did the simulation teach the U.S. about its financial war readiness? Well, in one word, vulnerability. But the full answer is far more unsettling than that. As Rickards sat in a high-tech warfare lab, watching elite minds simulate financial chaos, he realized something deeply uncomfortable. The United States was not prepared. Not even close. For all its might in tanks and jets and cyber shields, America was frighteningly fragile in the realm of financial warfare. Let's pause here and really let that sink in. Imagine you're watching a practice drill, where the most powerful nation in the world gets taken down. Not by bombs or missiles, but by a spreadsheet, a currency shift, or a digital run on the dollar. Sound dramatic? Maybe, but it wasn't fiction. This was a simulated reality, a war game run by the Pentagon, and it shook even seasoned analysts to the core. The most profound realization? Money has become a weapon, not a metaphorical one. An actual, strategic weapon in modern global conflict. Just like nuclear arms were the ultimate threat of the Cold War era, currencies, central banks, and sovereign funds now sit loaded and ready in today's economic arsenal. And unlike conventional weapons, they don't leave a visible crater when they strike. They ripple through economies, displace millions, crash systems quietly, and collapse empires without a single shot fired. Rickards witnessed something that most people, especially those outside elite financial and government circles, have no clue about. Our global financial system is deeply interconnected, dangerously fast, and shockingly easy to manipulate. And in a crisis, it wouldn't take much for the whole thing to spiral out of control. During the war game, teams learned how simple it was to create economic disarray. One group flooded the market with gold. Another started rumors about U.S. debt defaults. Others played with oil prices or sold off dollar reserves via proxy nations. In each case, the goal wasn't to win in a conventional sense. It was to destabilize confidence, to shift power away from the dollar, to weaponize trust, or more precisely, the loss of trust. And that's the thing about financial systems. They're not built on bricks or steel. They're built on belief. As long as people believe the dollar has value, it does. As long as banks believe other banks are solvent, they lend. But shake that belief, everything collapses like a house of cards. You don't need tanks at the border. Just a rumor on Bloomberg, a strategic sell-off, a whisper in the bond markets. The war game showed how fragile that belief really is. But here's the part that truly stings. Arrogance and complacency are our biggest threats. The U.S., as the dominant financial superpower, assumes resilience. It assumes control. It assumes everyone else plays fair. But global rivals? They've been quietly studying American weaknesses for years. Russia, China, even allies in Europe. They've seen how dependent the U.S. is on its reserve currency status. They understand how digital markets work, how algorithms could be exploited, and how one wrong signal could cause a cascade across stock exchanges, credit markets, and interest rates. And if we're being honest, the U.S. hasn't kept up. While financial engineers on Wall Street focus on quarterly profits and exotic derivatives, foreign powers are training economists and strategists in economic warfare. They're building gold reserves quietly, setting up currency swap lines, and reducing dependence on the dollar. It's subtle, but it's strategic, and it's accelerating. Rickards makes a powerful point here. He's not just waving around conspiracy theories or selling fear. He's calling attention to a silent arms race, one that's unfolding in markets and vaults, not missile silos. And just like the Cold War, those who ignore it risk becoming collateral damage. So, what do we take away from this chapter? First, we need to rethink how we see money. It's no longer just a tool of commerce. It's a lever of power, a sword and shield in global affairs. When a country can print or withhold trillions at will, that's not just economics, it's geopolitical force. Second, we need to understand the battlefield. Financial wars don't follow the rules of traditional warfare. They're asymmetric. They're fast. They're fought with data, rumors, trades, and code. And unlike wars of the past, they don't always make the news. At least, not until the damage is done. Third, the lesson from the Pentagon war game is chillingly clear. America is exposed, not just in its financial systems, but in its mindset. The belief that the dollar is untouchable is not a strategy, it's a weakness. Real strength lies in preparation, diversification, resilience. And we're not there yet. Emotionally, the chapter leaves you with a strange mix of awe and unease. It's like finding out your house, which looks sturdy from the outside, is actually riddled with termites underneath. The surface looks fine, but one strong gust or one strategic blow could bring the whole thing crashing down. And that's exactly where Rickards is guiding us. Because if a simulated war game could reveal all this, what happens when the war is real? In the next chapter, Rickards takes us deeper into the historical roots of financial conflict. If Chapter 1 was a wake-up call, Chapter 2 is a backstory, the part where we learn this isn't new. Currency wars have happened before. In fact, They've shaped empires, triggered revolutions, and rewritten global orders. So as we close out this first chapter, take a breath and ask yourself, are we living in an illusion of security, or are we simply asleep at the wheel? Because the battle for financial dominance isn't coming someday in the future. It's already begun, quietly, relentlessly. And as you'll soon see, history is full of warnings we've ignored before. Let's not make that mistake again. Chapter 2. Financial War. Imagine this. A country wakes up one morning to find its stock market in free fall, its currency plummeting, and its banks unable to meet their obligations. There's no declaration of war, no bombs in the air, no soldiers on the ground. Yet chaos reigns. Supermarket shelves empty overnight. Citizens rush to withdraw cash, only to be told their money is not available at this time. And somewhere, far from the panic, a team of economists and strategists nods quietly. The mission was a success. This is a new face of warfare, not wage of missiles, but with spreadsheets and algorithms. Now ask yourself, what if the real wars of the 21st century aren't fought on battlefields, but in boardrooms and trading floors? What if the power to destroy a nation's economy lies not in military arsenals, but in debt instruments, derivative positions, and central bank policy? This is the unsettling premise at the heart of James Rickards' second chapter, a chapter that pulls back the curtain on the strategic evolution of national economies and shows how countries are beginning to weaponize financial systems as tools of dominance and defense. But here's the thing, it didn't start with Wall Street or Silicon Valley. It began, as many things do, with survival. In the early days of nation building, economies existed to support the necessities of power, feeding armies, financing governments, and trading goods. Gold was king, not just for its luster, but for its immutability and universal value. It didn't matter who you were, Persian, Roman, or British. If you had gold, you had power. But over time, something subtle and seismic happened. Money became abstract. Paper replaced metal. Credit replaced coin. And eventually, trust replaced both. That's where things get interesting. Because once money was no longer backed by tangible value, it became a tool, malleable, manipulable, and immensely dangerous in the wrong hands. And that's exactly where we are today. In this chapter, Rickards brings us face to face with a provocative idea. Financial markets are not neutral. They can be strategic weapons, used to punish, isolate, or collapse a nation's economy without a single shot being fired. And more importantly, those who understand this new domain have a terrifying advantage over those still clinging to outdated ideas of war and peace. So, let's step into the world of strategic finance, where GDP is a shield, debt is a dagger, and central banks are the generals behind every major move. Picture China. For decades, it quietly accumulated U.S. Treasury bonds, ostensibly as a way to store its vast reserves. But was that all it was doing? Or was it strategically positioning itself to hold economic leverage over the United States? After all, if you're holding over $1 trillion of someone's debt and they depend on you to keep buying, who really has the upper hand? Now think about Russia. What does it mean when a country starts buying gold aggressively, reducing its reliance on the dollar, and establishing trade in alternative currencies? On the surface, it's financial housekeeping. But beneath that, it's preparation for economic warfare, an effort to build resilience against future sanctions, blockades, or financial attacks. And what about the U.S. itself? The dollar is the world's reserve currency, yes. But what happens if confidence in that currency is lost? What if other nations stop using it for trade? What if oil, long pegged to the dollar, begins to be priced in yuan or euros instead? Suddenly, America's greatest strength becomes its greatest vulnerability. Rickards poses the questions most economists are afraid to ask out loud. What if debt can be used as a Trojan horse? What if liquidity crises can be engineered deliberately? What if currency collapse is no longer a symptom, but a strategy? He challenges us to see the global economy not as a free market, but as a chessboard, where every move is calculated and every player is both exposed and empowered. And this brings us back to the simulation, the Pentagon's financial war game. Because while that exercise might have taken place behind closed doors, its lessons reverberate in every major policy decision being made today. The simulation didn't just test theories. It revealed a chilling truth. Most of our economic systems are based on assumptions of cooperation and rational behavior, and those assumptions break down completely in a wartime scenario. In other words, we are woefully unprepared. We've spent centuries refining the rules of trade, commerce, and diplomacy, but in the new world of currency wars, those rules don't apply. There are no Geneva Conventions for interest rate manipulation, no ceasefires for capital flight, no peace treaties when a bond market implodes. Rickards warns that this isn't science fiction. It's already happening. Quietly, incrementally. Every time a country imposes capital controls, it signals mistrust. Every time a central bank conducts quantitative easing, it floods the system with volatility. Every time nations hoard gold, they're hedging against the collapse of fiat trust. And every time global actors coordinate to freeze bank assets, block SWIFT access, or weaponize sanctions, they're effectively firing the first shots in a financial war. So where does that leave us? That's the big, haunting question Rickards leaves hanging in the air. Are we in the opening moves of global financial conflict? And if so, who's winning? In the pages ahead, this chapter will walk you through how national economies evolve from trade facilitators to strategic command centers, and how the once invisible hand of the market now wears a velvet glove over an iron fist. Because of the 20th century taught U.S. that war is too costly to fight with tanks and planes, the May 21st proved that the cheapest and most effective weapon is money itself. And the battlefield? It's already live. Imagine you're in a room where the next financial world war is quietly being simulated. No missives, no uniforms, just quiet urgency, glowing monitors, and men and women hunched over tables plotting the destruction of an economy. Ours, theirs, anyone's. This wasn't a scene from a Hollywood thriller. It was a Pentagon war game. James Rickards was there. He watched as economists, intelligence agents, policy experts, and military strategists, all tasked with defending America, began testing how a nation might wage war not with tanks, but with treasury bonds, gold, and market manipulation. At the Warfare Analysis Laboratory in Laurel, Maryland, the lines between military strength and financial stability began to blur. The battlefield wasn't a stretch of desert or ocean. It was the balance sheets, trading floors, and central bank reserves of global superpowers. The room itself looked like any other control center, sleek, quiet, humming with anticipation. But what happened inside was unlike anything the U.S. defense community had done before. Teams were assigned countries. Rickards' team was China. Their goal? To weaken the U.S. economy. The rules? There were almost none. This wasn't about ethics. It was about possibilities. How far could one nation go to destabilize another, using only money? You might think of financial warfare as simply stock market crashes or currency devaluations. But in this simulation, the participants explored far more sophisticated strategies. Imagine weaponizing gold, buying or dumping reserves in secret to create panic or inflation. Think of oil being used not just as a commodity, but as leverage in global supply chains. Consider sovereign wealth funds, massive national investment vehicles, being used to suddenly sell off U.S. assets, triggering a panic in the dollar. This wasn't speculation. These were real, plausible actions that nations could take. One tactic the team used was surprisingly simple. Accumulate gold, and then launch a new currency backed by that gold. They called it the golden yuan. The idea? Undermine global confidence in the U.S. dollar, the very backbone of America's economic dominance. Rickards watched as the simulation exposed how dependent the U.S. was on its currency's perceived stability. If the dollar were ever seriously challenged, even if only psychologically, the entire system could unravel faster than any military strike could achieve. And it wasn't just about external attacks. One of the most chilling revelations from a war game was how unprepared the U.S. was for internal weaknesses being exploited. The U.S. financial system, for all its sophistication, was exposed as a delicate ecosystem, intricate, interdependent, and shockingly vulnerable to asymmetric strategies. In one scenario, an adversary didn't even need to destroy anything. They just had to disrupt trust, trigger a run on a bank, alter a few numbers in a trading algorithm, leak a false report about the Federal. In a world ruled by confidence in algorithms, small manipulations could spiral into global crises. Rickards realized something profound during the exercise. The true strength of an economy isn't its GDP or the size of its stock market. It's the trust people place in its institutions. And trust, once shaken, is hard to restore. Take a moment to let that sink in. America's economic supremacy doesn't rest on the sheer size of its military or even the volume of dollars in circulation. It rests on an idea, the belief that the dollar is sound, that markets will function, that the U.S. will make good on its debts. But belief is fragile, and the war game revealed just how easily that belief could be undermined. Rickards described the experience as a kind of intellectual earthquake. He watched as teams playing adversaries like Russia and Iran deftly maneuvered financial tools to simulate collapse, not in decades, not over years, but in weeks, sometimes even days. And it wasn't just theory. These were tactics grounded in reality, things that could, and in some cases already had, been attempted. You might wonder, what about cyber attacks? Aren't they a more likely method of economic sabotage? They are indeed a threat, but what the war game emphasized was something even more subtle. Cyber attacks might damage infrastructure, but financial warfare attacks the bloodstream of a country. It goes for the heart, confidence, and money itself. In that sense, financial manipulation is more insidious. It leaves no physical trace, but the destruction it causes can be far more devastating. Think of it like this. Cyber attacks are blunt instruments, like smashing a window. Financial warfare, by contrast, is like poisoning the water. Slow, silent, lethal. What startled Rickards most wasn't just the creativity of the enemy teams, but how realistic their strategies were. These weren't science fiction scenarios. They were grounded in actual capabilities and behaviors of real-world players. China has been stockpiling gold. Russia has been experimenting with alternative currency arrangements. Oil-producing nations have flexed their economic muscles before. The pieces are already on the board. And yet, Rickards noticed a dangerous complacency. Many in the defense and economic establishment were still thinking in Cold War terms, bombs, borders, and boots on the ground. But the battlefield had moved. It was now inside financial markets, behind central bank doors, and within high-frequency trading algorithms. There was one particularly sobering moment when a simulated attack caused a cascading crisis across U.S. markets. Stocks tumbled, credit froze, the dollar wavered, all in a matter of hours. As Rickards watched the scenario unfold, he realized that we were witnessing a plausible version of economic Armageddon, not because of warheads, but because of spreadsheets. The war game ended. The teams filed out. The data was analyzed. But for Rickards, something fundamental had changed. He had seen the future of conflict, and it didn't look like war as we know it. It looked like manipulation, mistrust, monetary collapse. And it was terrifyingly plausible. That night, he couldn't stop thinking about what he'd witnessed. The U.S., a global giant, was walking a tightrope. Every financial action, every trade deal, every bond sale was part of a larger game, one that most people weren't even aware was being played. And worst of all, most of America's leaders still seemed to think we were playing checkers, while our adversaries had long switched to chess. Imagine walking out of a simulation that felt more like prophecy than play. You just spent days inside a controlled environment where every click, trade, or cyber tactic revealed not just possibilities, but weaknesses. Not in theory, not in some faraway country, but in your own. That's exactly how James Rickards and his fellow participants felt as they left the financial war game hosted by the Pentagon. What was meant to be an exercise had morphed into an alarming exposure. The United States wasn't prepared, not in the ways that really mattered. The most powerful economy in the world had built its financial dominance on sand. And now, someone had turned on the fan. The war game had done something rare. It had shattered illusions. It showed that financial war, unlike conventional war, could be waged silently, invisibly, and with plausible deniability. No soldiers, no bombs, just algorithms, currency trades, and a little strategic patience. Rickards and his team had tried these very tactics and watched the system stagger under pressure. If this could happen in a simulation, what about the real world? So what exactly did this war game teach the U.S.? First, that money is no longer just money. It's a weapon. Just as you wouldn't go to war with faulty missiles, you shouldn't go to economic battle with outdated financial defenses. The simulation made one thing crystal clear. Traditional thinking about economic strength was dangerously out of step with new forms of geopolitical conflict. You don't need an army to bring a nation to its knees. You just need access to its financial arteries. The US dollar's dominance has long been treated like an indestructible fortress. But Rickards saw how easy it was to exploit that very confidence. By coordinating trades, weaponizing foreign exchange reserves, or leveraging gold in strategic ways, a hostile actor could shake the dollar's foundation, or at least sow enough chaos to force Washington into reaction mode. Think of the global financial system like a massive, high-speed train network. In theory, it's sleek and unbreakable. But all it takes is a well-placed object on the tracks, or worse, someone hacking the signaling system, to bring it crashing down. What hit hardest wasn't just a technical vulnerability. It was the mindset of complacency. The war game participants came in assuming American superiority. Of course the U.S. would win. That's the default narrative. But the exercise didn't reward ideology. It rewarded insight and adaptability. And what it exposed was the fragility of our assumptions. The financial system, complex as it may seem, is built on trust, perception, and interdependence. Undermine just one of those pillars, and the structure begins to wobble. Then came a more sobering realization. These weren't hypotheticals. The real world was already playing out versions of the currency war game. Rickards pointed to China's quiet accumulation of gold, Russia's experiments with bypassing the dollar, and the 2008 financial crisis as examples of conflict already unfolding in slow motion. These weren't war games. They were the war. Let's pause here and ask a deeply uncomfortable question. What if the greatest threat to U.S. national security isn't a rogue missile or a cyber attack, but a carefully orchestrated sell-off of U.S. Treasury bonds? Or a foreign government quietly cornering the gold market? Or a new currency standard that sidelines the dollar altogether? These scenarios aren't fiction. They are the very playbook tested during the Pentagon's financial war simulation, and they worked. Rickards' voice takes on a note of urgency here, because this isn't about academic debate anymore. It's about real-world consequences. The stakes are no longer theoretical, they're existential. And what's worse, the system is still vulnerable. After the simulation ended, there was no sweeping reform, no overnight transformation of economic policy. In fact, Rickards laments, most policymakers didn't even understand the gravity of what they had seen. They nodded, took notes, and returned to business as usual. And here lies the most haunting lesson. Arrogance can be fatal in financial warfare. Believing in your own invincibility is precisely how you lose. Rome didn't fall in a day. It decayed from within while ignoring threats from without. Rickards saw the same pattern in America's response to financial threats. Too much pride, too little foresight. Now, as we look ahead, Rickards invites us to follow the threads the war game left behind. If money can be weaponized, and if simulations can be prophetic, then we must ask, what will the next real battle look like? Not on a screen, not in a lab, but out there in the real world. Will it be triggered by a sudden devaluation? A coordinated attack on the dollar? A debt crisis fueled by strategic dumping of U.S. bonds? These are not distant fears. They are emerging realities. As nations grow more sophisticated in using financial tools for political gain, we move closer to a world where markets and war blur into a single battlefield. The age of tanks and airstrikes hasn't ended, but it now shares space with interest rates and gold bars. Rickards argues that the first shots of the next global conflict may be fired in trading rooms, not trenches. And that brings us to the real power of the war game. It offered a preview of the battlefield of tomorrow. It taught Rickards and his fellow players that America's real vulnerabilities aren't just military or diplomatic. They're deeply financial. The currency wars aren't coming. They've already begun. We just haven't recognized the early battles for what they are. As we turn the page to Chapter 3, the question shifts. If the war game exposed the danger, what does real-world confrontation look like? How did we get here? And how far are we willing to go to win? Because if the simulation proved anything, it's that money is not just a medium of exchange. It's a message, a strategy, and yes, a weapon. Are we ready for a world where the next 9/11 might not destroy buildings, but wealth, stability, and trust? That's where Rickards is taking us next. Chapter 3. Reflections on a Golden Age. Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that the rules of money you've lived by your entire life no longer apply. The dollars in your wallet suddenly buy half as much. Your savings quietly evaporating. Your investments tumbling like dominoes. You didn't make any bad decisions. You didn't gamble in the market or blow your budget. And yet, your financial world is crumbling. Because somewhere behind closed doors, a different kind of war has begun. One where bullets aren't fired, but economic systems collapse. This isn't fiction. It's a chilling possibility that James Rickards urges us to confront as we step into Chapter 3 of Currency Wars. Here, we dive beneath the surface of traditional combat and enter a battlefield where central banks, currency reserves, trade deficits, and debt ceilings are the new artillery. It's a world where decisions made in Washington, Beijing, or Brussels ripple across the planet like shockwaves, sometimes overnight. So here's the unsettling question. What happens when a nation decides that the best way to gain power isn't to launch a missile, but to manipulate the value of its currency? What if the next global war is already happening? Not with tanks rolling across borders, but with currency devaluations, secret deals, and central bank interventions silently reshaping the global balance of power. That's exactly where Rickards takes us now. In the previous chapters, we peeked into the war rooms, literally watching Pentagon analysts and Wall Street veterans simulate economic attacks and defenses. But those were war games. In Chapter 3, the gloves start come off. This section draws us into the very real history and strategy of using money as a weapon, an old concept that's been reborn with devastating potential in the modern age. To understand this fully, Rickards invites us to reflect on history, not just economic downturns or recessions, but full-blown financial conflicts that were fought with currency as the main weapon. Take, for instance, the massive currency manipulations of the 1920s and 1930s, decisions that helped trigger the Great Depression and later World War II. Or fast forward to more recent times. The sharp currency movements between the dollar and the yuan, the quiet tensions between the U.S. and the European Central Bank, the oil for yuan agreements that bypass the petrodollar. These moments aren't isolated. They are chapters in an ongoing story, a hidden war unfolding over decades. And here's the kicker. Most of us don't even see it happening. That's what makes this war so insidious. Unlike a traditional war, where the threat is visible, soldiers, tanks, airstrikes, this war unfolds in press releases from central banks, in the language of interest rate hikes, quantitative easing, and stimulus packages. It moves through stock tickers and debt-to-GDP ratios. And yet, the effects can be just as devastating as a physical invasion. Think about it. When a country like the U.S. prints trillions of dollars in response to a financial crisis, that's not just a domestic decision. It affects the value of currencies around the world. It alters trade balances. It triggers inflation or deflation in emerging markets. And when countries respond by devaluing their own currencies to stay competitive, a domino effect begins. One currency falls, another retaliates, and before you know it, the world is plunged into what Rickards calls a currency war, a downward spiral with no clear winner, only casualties. So again, the big questions loom. Can a country destroy another without ever firing a shot? Is it possible to gain dominance in the world by quietly manipulating economic levers instead of conquering territory? As you start to see the patterns Rickards lays out, it becomes harder and harder to dismiss these questions. And the more you understand how money actually works, not just in your wallet, but on the global scale, the more urgent those questions become. Because here's the truth. Your wealth, your security, and your future are not just influenced by your financial decisions. They're also shaped, sometimes entirely, by forces far beyond your control. By decisions made in the Federal Reserve or the People's Bank of China. By moves on the geopolitical chessboard that are cloaked in fiscal policy, exchange rates, and international trade deals. And the worst part? The people making these decisions are not always on the same side. In fact, as Rickards lays out in this chapter, many of them are actively competing against one another, desperately try and protect their national interests while pushing the rest of the world to the edge of the economic cliff. It's like a massive multiplayer game of poker, where each nation bluffs, folds, and raises stakes with trillions of dollars, and nobody really knows who holds the winning hand, or when someone might flip the table. This section begins to pull back the curtain on how those games are played, who the key players are, and why the stakes are higher now than ever before. The financial world may seem calm on the surface, but underneath it, there's a storm brewing. And unlike in the past, when economic wars took years to play out, today's global markets are so interconnected that a single misstep or a calculated move can send shockwaves in seconds. We've moved past the era of physical invasions being the primary form of dominance. In this new age, the ability to control the narrative of money, what it's worth, who prints it, and how it flows, is more powerful than any standing army. And perhaps that's the most haunting question of all. If the value of money can be manipulated so easily by those in power, then what is money really worth? That question, seemingly philosophical, is at the heart of Rickards' exploration. Because if money is no longer a stable measure of value, then everything else, your savings, your investments, even your labor, becomes unstable too. As we step deeper into this chapter, the urgency mounts. Rickards isn't just teaching us economic theory. He's issuing a warning, a call to wake up to a reality that's already unfolding. The war isn't coming. It's already here. And unless we understand the battlefield, we might not realize we've lost until it's too late. So let's keep going. The curtain is lifting. And the next part of this journey shows us exactly how this war has been fought in the past, and how dangerously close we are to repeating the same mistakes again. Imagine walking through a bustling marketplace where every nation is a merchant, and currency is the language they use to trade. Now imagine one of the merchants starts whispering in the ears of others, devaluing another's goods not by quality, but by manipulating the very measure of value. That's what a monetary attack looks like. It's subtle, it's calculated, and in the world of currency wars, it's deadly. Let's now dive into mechanics behind such attacks, not the theory, but the real strategies, the tools, and the consequences of what happens when money itself becomes a weapon. When most people think of war, they picture soldiers, tanks, and airstrikes. But what if a war could be waged invisibly, through spreadsheets, interest rate shifts, or subtle market nudges? James Rickards introduces us to this darker side of global economics, where a central bank's decision can have ripple effects as powerful as any bomb. A monetary attack begins with intention. Whether the central bank lowering interest rates, a government announcing a competitive devaluation, or foreign reserves being dumped into market, every move has a ripple effect. These aren't just economic strategies. They are deliberate acts with political, strategic, and sometimes even military intent. One key tool in this arsenal is the manipulation of exchange rates. Let's say country A wants to gain an advantage over country B. If country A artificially lowers the value of its currency, either through printing more money or slashing interest rates, its exports suddenly become cheaper for foreign buyers. That may sound like a win, but it devastates country B's economy, where producers can't compete with the now underpriced imports. Factories shut down, jobs are lost, and resentment brews. This is not a hypothetical. It's what China was accused of for years, holding down the yuan to flood U.S. markets with cheaper goods. The U.S., in turn, often retaliated with threats of tariffs or pressure on the Federal Reserve to adjust interest rates. But Rickards peels back a more chilling layer. These actions aren't just economic, they're strategic. In the modern world, draining a nation's economy can be more effective than bombing its infrastructure. Another weapon in the monetary war chest is reserve diversification. The subtle shift of central banks moving away from U.S. dollars into alternative assets like gold or euros. At first glance, this looks like simple financial housekeeping. But Rickards explains it's anything but. When major holders of U.S. debt, countries like China or Russia, start selling treasuries and buying gold, it signals a loss of confidence in America's economic leadership. Worse, it weakens the dollar, drives up borrowing costs for the U.S., and introduces instability into the entire global financial system. Then there's gold, often dismissed in modern times as a relic, but in currency wars, it becomes a cornerstone. Rickards recounts how China and Russia quietly built massive gold reserves. Why? Because gold can't be devalued with a keystroke. It's immune to the whims of central banks. In a financial crisis, gold offers not just value, but leverage. If fiat currencies collapse, nations with gold will still be able to trade, stabilize, and survive. Even sovereign wealth funds, massive state-owned investment portfolios, can become tools of attack. Imagine a nation using its oil revenue fund to dump U.S. stocks en masse. The market crashes. Panic ensues. Capital flees. That's not just a market correction. It's a financial offensive. But here's the twist. Unlike traditional war, where an attack is visible and traceable, a monetary assault is ambiguous. No missiles are launched. No soldiers march. And yet, the damage can be profound. Rickards underscores this with a haunting idea: plausible deniability. If a country crashes your markets, how do you prove it wasn't just a normal economic event? How do you retaliate when the enemy hides behind spreadsheets? The deeper implication, as Rickards reveals, is that financial systems are incredibly fragile. They're built on trust, speed, and interdependence. Just one disruption, like a central bank misstep or a coordinated currency sell-off, can unravel entire economies. And the scariest part? In our hyperconnected world, contagion is almost guaranteed. A crisis in one major economy doesn't stay contained. It spreads like fire through dry brush. Let's return briefly to the analogy of hacking. In cybersecurity, you can cripple a nation by infiltrating its power grid, disrupting communication, or erasing data. In monetary warfare, the concept is eerily similar. By hacking the financial bloodstream, currency flows, reserves, capital markets, you paralyze the very infrastructure that keeps a society functional. Rickards paints a picture of monetary war that is not about profit, but about power. Nations don't engage in currency wars to enrich themselves in the short term. They do it to position themselves better in the long term, to weaken rivals, to secure leverage, and to hedge against future turmoil. This shift in motive changes everything. It means we're not just talking about interest rates or GDP. We're talking about geopolitics, national survival, global order. Perhaps most revealing is Rickards' insight into how most policymakers don't even recognize these attacks. They operate under the outdated assumption that monetary policy is purely domestic. They don't see that in today's world, every rate cut, every debt issuance, every QE program has international ramifications. And those ramifications, when misunderstood or ignored, become vulnerabilities. So what does this all mean for you and me, ordinary citizens? It means that the value of our money, the safety of our jobs, and the future of our economies are influenced not just by our governments, but by decisions made in faraway capitals. It means that financial stability is no longer just about inflation or growth. It's about strategy. And in a game where the rules are opaque and the players are silent, the stakes have never been higher. Rickards wants us to wake up, to realize that in a world of currency wars, we are all on the battlefield, even if we don't see the bombs falling. So here we are, standing at the crossroads where games of strategy become real-world warnings. After the dust settled from the Pentagon's financial war simulation, and after the intellectual adrenaline wore off, what was left wasn't just a list of theoretical moves. It was a mirror, a harsh, unflinching reflection of how vulnerable the financial foundations of the United States had become. The war game wasn't just an exercise. It was a wake-up call that too few heeded. What exactly did the simulation reveal? More than most were ready to hear. The uncomfortable truth was this. In a world where money flows faster than any bullet and decisions made in milliseconds can wipe out fortunes or economies, the United States was simply not prepared. Financial war readiness? Practically non-existent. And unlike traditional warfare, there were no tanks to build, no aircraft carriers to deploy. The battlefield had shifted, but the generals hadn't kept up. This wasn't just about economics. It was about national security. The simulation had exposed how foreign adversaries could use the tools of Wall Street, derivatives, currency swaps, sovereign debt, central bank policy, as weapons. Think about that for a moment. Instead of launching missiles, a hostile power could sell off U.S. Treasury bonds en masse, short the dollar, manipulate commodity markets, or hoard gold to trigger a panic. No need for troops on the ground when a few keystrokes can set fire to global confidence. But let's dig deeper into something James Rickards kept circling back to. Money itself is now more dangerous than missiles. That sounds dramatic, doesn't it? But here's why it's true. Missiles have a blast radius. They affect what's within physical reach. But money affects confidence, trust, and the invisible web that connects every bank, business, and nation. When trust is lost in a currency, it's like oxygen disappearing from a room. Panic sets in. Systems crash. People freeze. Rickards paints a chilling picture. We're fighting battles on financial terrain without a playbook. There's no Geneva Convention for currency wars. No formal declaration. No armistice. Just a slow, steady unraveling, like an invisible hand tipping over dominoes. And the terrifying part? The U.S. was acting as if it couldn't happen here. That arrogance, complacency wrapped in pride, is perhaps the most dangerous vulnerability of all. During the simulation, Rickards noted how some high-ranking officials resisted the idea that the dollar could ever be dethroned. After all, hadn't it been the world's reserve currency since Bretton Woods? Didn't every central bank hold dollars as a sign of strength? Yes, but history is littered with empires that thought they were untouchable until the rules changed. You could sense the unease growing in the room as the scenarios played out. It wasn't just a game anymore. It was an unveiling. The very systems that Americans trusted to protect their financial futures, Federal Reserve policy, capital markets, international agreements, were shown to be breakable, fragile, even exploitable. And that's where the emotional undercurrent of this chapter really hits home. Rickards doesn't scream or point fingers. Instead, he lets the reader feel it. This creeping, almost paralyzing awareness that the world is changing faster than our leaders can comprehend. There's a tension that builds not from action, but from insight, like watching a slow leak in a dam, while everyone else is dancing on the edge of the floodplain. But perhaps the most sobering realization from the war game wasn't about the strategies themselves. It was about the mindset. The U.S., for all its might, still viewed financial warfare as secondary to traditional conflict, as if bombs and drones would always be more dangerous than bond markets and currency swaps. Rickards is urging us to wake up, to stop thinking of economics as boring or theoretical. In the modern world, your financial system is your national defense. Let's not forget, real-world currency wars aren't on the horizon. They've already begun. Rickards opens the door to this chilling truth, an invitation to look beyond the war game and into history, recent and distant. From China's quiet stockpiling of gold to Russia's aggressive de-dollarization moves, the signs are everywhere. Nations are preparing, positioning, and protecting themselves for a future where financial dominance is just as important as military dominance. And here's where Rickards masterfully pivots. He doesn't close the chapter with panic or despair. Instead, he leaves us with a breadcrumb trail of what's to come. If simulations reveal vulnerability, what happens when theory meets reality? If currencies can be used as weapons, how do we defend ourselves? Individually, institutionally, as a nation? The stage is now set. The war game has shown us the battlefield. The weapons have been identified. The stakes could not be higher. In Chapter 4 and beyond, Rickards will take us deeper into the history and strategies behind currency manipulation. He'll pull back the curtain on real-world financial conflicts, show us how nations use inflation and devaluation as tools of policy and warfare, and ask the most urgent question of all, how we survive a war most people don't even know is happening. So if you're feeling a little rattled right now, that's a good sign. It means you're listening. It means you're beginning to see the invisible war for what it is. Not a game of numbers and charts, but a high-stakes power struggle that touches every dollar in your pocket and every future plan you've ever made. This is the war of our time, and we've only just begun to understand its rules. Chapter 4, Currency War I, 1921 to 1936. You're standing in the heart of a bustling financial district, perhaps Wall Street, perhaps Shanghai, maybe even Dubai. The air buzzes with energy. Traders are shouting. Screens flash with numbers and headlines. The flow of capital zips invisibly through fiber optic cables under oceans and cities. The stock market ticks higher. Currencies fluctuate with every press conference and whisper from central banks. It all feels so normal. But what if, beneath that hum of routine, a silent war is raging? A war without guns. A battlefield without borders. A conflict fought not with bullets, but with bonds, not with armies, but with algorithms. What if the entire global financial system, this massive humming machine we've come to trust, could be turned against us? What if it already has? That's a chilling possibility Chapter 4 of Currency Wars asks us to confront. Because if you really think about it, what happens when the instruments meant to bring stability become tools of destabilization? What happens when money isn't just currency but a missile? Let's rewind for a moment. We've already seen how the U.S. military ran war games to model financial attacks. We've seen the unsettling results, how fragile and unprepared even the most powerful economy can be in the face of monetary manipulation. But simulations are one thing. Theory is clean, abstract, removed. What happens when the real world takes a swing? This is where the narrative turns sharply. Rickards now peels back the veil and invites us to examine actual currency warfare already in motion. This isn't just a hypothetical anymore. It's history. It's happening. And it started years before most of us realized. The early 2000s were more than just a post-dot-com rebuilding phase. Beneath the surface, a new kind of global chess game was beginning to unfold. And this time, the key players weren't just military generals or elected leaders. They were central bankers, economists, hedge fund managers, global institutions whose decisions carried consequences on par with tanks rolling across borders. Chapter 4 zooms in on this growing realization that countries no longer need to invade to dominate. They don't have to drop bombs to assert control. Instead, they can devalue their currencies. They can flood markets with liquidity. They can shift capital, spark inflation, or hoard strategic resources like gold, all with the stroke of a keyboard. And while this new terrain lacks the drama of a battlefield, it is no less consequential. Take this in. What if you could bring a nation to its knees not by destroying its infrastructure, but by collapsing its currency? What if economic sabotage became the new art of war? Think of how dependent our lives have become on confidence. Confidence in the banking system, in interest rates, in the value of a dollar or a euro or a yen. Undermine that confidence, even subtly, and the ripple effect can be devastating. Panic, hoarding, bank runs, capital flight, recession, and all without a single shot fired. Rickards introduces us to this world of silent skirmishes, where China, Russia, and the United States aren't just economic competitors, but financial adversaries, each testing the limits of currency manipulation for strategic advantage. And this shift from physical war to fiscal warfare isn't just theoretical. It's rooted in long-standing traditions of statecraft. In fact, the term currency war itself dates back nearly a century. During the Great Depression, nations fought bitterly to out-devalue one another's currencies in a desperate attempt to revive exports and protect their economies. It was a race to the bottom, and it only deepened the global crisis. The scars of that period shaped international financial systems for decades. But by the early 21st century, those old tactics began to resurface, only this time under new names: quantitative easing, competitive devaluation, capital controls. And this is where Rickards truly sharpens the edge of the argument, that we've entered a new phase of conflict, where these subtle tools are being wielded as deliberate weapons. The chapter asks us to consider something both unnerving and profound. Could these monetary decisions, seemingly the domain of technocrats and economists, actually carry the same moral weight and threat as military actions? If a missile kills 1,000 people and a monetary attack collapses an economy affecting millions, are they really that different? This is the philosophical crux Rickards wants us to wrestle with. Because when central banks print trillions of dollars, when governments hoard gold, when economies intentionally weaken their currencies for strategic gain, they may be doing more than playing economic games. They may be launching the opening salvos of a war we haven't learned how to fight. So as you listen to this chapter unfold, think about the tools we take for granted every day: interest rates, inflation, foreign exchange. Think about the financial systems that feel as solid as the buildings that house them. And now, imagine them as weapons. Weapons that don't look like guns but are aimed just as deliberately. Weapons that don't explode but implode. And the most haunting question of all, what happens when the victims don't even realize they're under attack? As we dive deeper into Chapter 4, Rickards begins connecting dots most of us would never think to link. He takes us inside boardrooms and backroom meetings, exposing how global powers posture and position themselves using money as leverage, not diplomacy. He traces the ripple effects of these strategies, not just in GDP numbers or stock indexes, but in the lives of everyday people. Because when a currency collapses, it isn't just an economic statistic. It's someone's lost job, someone's wiped out savings, a family's vanished security. Rickards wants us to feel that, to understand that these are not abstract ideas playing out in think tanks and finance ministries. They are real, visceral consequences that shape lives and nations alike. And he warns, the longer we pretend this isn't war, the more vulnerable we become. This isn't just about economics anymore. It's about national security. It's about survival. Imagine a battlefield where bullets are never fired and tanks never roll. Yet destruction still rains down, silent, invisible, and devastating. This is the new frontier of warfare, where spreadsheets replace missiles, and the click of a mouse can collapse a nation's economy. James Rickards, seated in a darkened room within the Warfare Analysis Laboratory at the Applied Physics Laboratory of Johns Hopkins University, wasn't watching troops advance or jets scream overhead. He was witnessing something far more insidious, the opening salvos of financial war. This was not a theoretical brainstorm. It was a war game. But instead of soldiers in fatigues, there were economists, intelligence officers, hedge fund managers, policy experts, and national security advisors. And instead of maps with moving battalions, there were interconnected financial systems, sovereign wealth strategies, and global currency flows. The war game was meticulously designed to test a chilling question. What happens when nations use money as a weapon? The simulation began like any real-world confrontation might. Slowly, with a series of moves that seemed more like policy shifts than acts of aggression. One nation devalued its currency. Another dumped a large portion of U.S. Treasury bonds on the market. A third began demanding payment for oil and gold instead of dollars. The game escalated with precision, each move designed not to cause immediate chaos, but to subtly undermine trust in the U.S. dollar and in global financial stability. Rickards, playing on the side of the United States, was stunned. The seemingly secure financial infrastructure of the U.S., long considered the backbone of global capitalism, was showing signs of real vulnerability. The deeper the simulation went, the more it became evident. America's economy was a glass tower. From the outside, it gleamed with strength, but under stress, it could shatter. What the simulation revealed wasn't just theoretical weakness. It was systemic fragility. U.S. financial dominance was built not solely on economic fundamentals, but on confidence. Confidence in the dollar, confidence in the government's ability to manage debt, and confidence that the U.S. would always remain the epicenter of global trade and capital. But confidence is not a concrete foundation. It's more like trust suspended on a tightrope. And in this game, that rope was fraying fast. Participants in the simulation discovered just how easy it was to exploit distrust. One scenario involved a coordinated sell-off of U.S. Treasury securities by foreign governments, primarily China and Russia, executed in tandem with public declarations questioning the solvency of the United States. Another scenario saw oil-producing nations demanding euros or gold instead of dollars, driving up demand for alternative currencies and signaling the erosion of the petrodollar system. The result? A spiraling dollar, stock market collapse, and a complete freeze in credit markets, all within a span of days. Rickard began to realize that this was more than just a war game. It was a rehearsal for what could become a real-world showdown. And in that moment, the most shocking insight dawned on him. The United States was utterly unprepared for a financial war. This unpreparedness wasn't due to a lack of intelligence or capability. It stemmed from a fundamental misunderstanding of what war means in the 21st century. Traditionally, wars are measured in territory gained, soldiers lost, or enemies subdued. But financial wars are different. Their terrain is digital. Their soldiers wear suits, and their weapons include things like credit default swaps, currency devaluations, and capital controls. The aim isn't to kill, it's to paralyze. And the most dangerous thing? The victims might not even know they're under attack until it's too late. The simulation highlighted a key distinction between cyber attacks and financial manipulation. While cyber attacks typically target infrastructure, power grids, communications networks, classified systems, financial manipulation targets the very bloodstream of an economy, its monetary system. Imagine someone slowly injecting poison into the bloodstream of a healthy person. At first, the person might feel tired, maybe dizzy, but by the time the damage is diagnosed, the organs are already failing. That's what a financial attack looks like. Slow erosion, then sudden collapse. And here's where it got even more unsettling. The war game showed that traditional economic defenses, like interest rate policy, fiscal stimulus, and central bank backstops, might be too slow or ineffective in the face of coordinated, multi-front financial aggression. In one simulation, a delay in responding to a gold for oil trade cascade caused a domino effect across global bond markets. By the time the U.S. Treasury and Federal Reserve intervened, it was too late. The damage had been done. What's more, these attacks didn't require large-scale operations. Just a few well-placed trades, a shift in reserve holdings by a major central bank, or a change in international payment settlement standards could send tremors through the system. The war game exposed how interconnected and delicate the global economy had become, and how America's dominance could be turned against itself. Consider gold. In the simulation, gold wasn't just a hedge or a reserve asset. It was a weapon. Nations could demand payment in gold to avoid U.S. surveillance or sanctions. They could manipulate gold prices to create panic in currency markets or drain U.S. reserves. Rickards observed that gold, long dismissed by modern economists as a barbarous relic, still held immense power in psychological and political terms. Its use as a financial weapon was not just plausible, it was probable. Similarly, oil proved to be another potent weapon. By shifting oil transactions away from the dollar, nations could weaken demand for currency and erode its status as a global reserve. Sovereign wealth funds, massive pools of government-controlled capital, could stealthily exit U.S. assets, destabilizing equity and bond markets while maintaining plausible deniability. Rickards recalled how one team in the game exploited derivatives, complex financial instruments that few people fully understand, to build a position that resembled an economic neutron bomb. When triggered, it devastated markets without leaving a trace of its origin. It was elegant, terrifying, disturbingly effective. And yet, even with these revelations laid bare in the safety of simulation, Rickards felt a chilling sense of disbelief. The war game wasn't taken seriously by many in the higher echelons of power. Some viewed it as a curiosity, a theoretical experiment divorced from real conflict. But Rickards knew better. What they had just witnessed wasn't fiction. It was foresight. The implications were enormous. If these tactics could be imagined in a lab, they could be executed in the world. And given geopolitical tensions, rival nations like China and Russia already had the tools and motivation to act. In fact, Rickards suspected, correctly, as he would later explore, that such currency wars were already underway, just masked behind headlines about trade deficits, interest rates, and global competitiveness. The true nature of warfare had changed, and the U.S., so confident in its military superiority, was asleep at the wheel when it came to financial defense. Rickards left the war game with a profound sense of urgency. America was vulnerable not because it lacked strength, but because it lacked imagination. It was preparing for yesterday's war while tomorrow's war crept through the back door. And perhaps that was the most dangerous vulnerability of all. Sometimes the scariest threats are the ones we can't see, the ones that don't come with sirens blaring or headlines screaming. The war game simulation at the Warfare Analysis Laboratory was meant to reveal the kind of war that lurks beneath our assumptions. And when it was over, there was a heavy silence in the room. Not the kind that follows victory, but the kind that signals a sobering realization. The United States, for all its military might, was frighteningly unprepared for the invisible battlefield of financial war. What the simulation taught was more than just tactics and theories. It revealed a vulnerability so embedded in our systems that we hardly noticed it until it was put on display. These weren't just hypotheticals. This was a controlled peek into what could unfold in the real world. And the lesson? The very lifeblood of modern civilization, money, credit, trust, is no longer just a medium of exchange. It has become a weapon. One of the most chilling insights from the exercise was how deeply interconnected and fragile the U.S. financial system really is. The ease with which a coordinated attack could unravel everything from Wall Street operations to Treasury auctions wasn't just theoretical. It was demonstrated in real time by seasoned strategists role-playing America's adversaries. They used tools like sovereign wealth funds, currency swaps, gold reserves, and debt purchases, things that we usually consider as economic levers, not instruments of destruction. And here's the twist that kept echoing in Rickards' mind long after the war game ended. The weapons in this financial war are already in play. We're not waiting for someone to invent them. They're active, moving silently across global markets, shifting power, sowing instability, and redrawing lines of influence without a single bullet fired. What does it mean when oil pricing becomes political? When central banks manipulate interest rates not just to manage economies but to wage subtle war? When nations accumulate or dump foreign currencies as an act of aggression, it means that the game has already begun, and we might be playing catch-up. So, why is money now a more dangerous weapon than missiles? Because it doesn't trigger an immediate alarm. A missile flies overhead, and radars light up. A cyber attack hits a network, and the IT systems scream. But a sudden dump of treasury bonds by a major holder like China, a sharp revaluation of a currency by a hostile power, a spike in gold prices driven by coordinated purchases from geopolitical rivals? These don't look like attacks until the damage has already been done. By the time we recognize what's happening, markets may have collapsed, confidence may have eroded, and ordinary citizens, people like you and me, could find their savings wiped out or their pensions devalued. It's like boiling a frog, slowly. The heat rises so gradually that you don't realize the danger until it's too late. That's the nature of financial war. It's slow, subtle, and deeply psychological. And that's what makes it so dangerous. Another lesson, perhaps the most human of all, was the arrogance and complacency of the United States. In traditional war scenarios, we walk in with confidence. We have the aircraft carriers, the satellites, the cyber units. But in this room, when the rules changed, that confidence melted away. The war game forced seasoned defense and intelligence professionals to admit that in this new battlefield, America's playbook was thin. There were no commanding officers barking out orders, no clear chain of command, just markets, ruthless, chaotic, global. Rickards captured the mood perfectly. We've been lulled into a false sense of security. We believe that economic dominance means financial invincibility. But what if the very size and complexity of our financial system is our Achilles heel? What if being the center of global finance makes us the biggest and most attractive target? That emotional realization of standing in a room full of experts and realizing no one had a solid defense was perhaps more alarming than the simulation itself. And it raises a haunting question. If we can't defend against a war game, what happens when a real adversary strikes? Because here's the reality. Currency wars are no longer theoretical. They are here. They are happening. They are embedded in trade policies, interest rate maneuvers, and monetary expansion. The quantitative easing efforts by central banks, they're not just domestic economic tools. They're chess moves in a global game. When one country weakens its currency to boost exports, another is forced to respond. It becomes a race to the bottom, and the casualties are ordinary people facing inflation, unemployment, and uncertainty. So, what do we take from all of this? First, that financial war is not a future event. It's a present danger. It's already part of our world, woven into the policies and behaviors of governments and institutions. Second, that preparedness doesn't just mean stockpiling weapons or building bunkers. It means rethinking how we understand power. In a world where algorithms can trigger market collapses and political leaders can weaponize economic data, we need strategists, not just soldiers. And third, that the greatest threat may be our own blindness. The belief that it can't happen here, that the US dollar is forever supreme, that our markets are too big to fail. Those beliefs are comforting but dangerous. The war game was designed to break those illusions, and it succeeded. As we transition into the next chapter, we begin to move from the theoretical into the real. If the war game showed us how the system could be attacked, What about actual attempts? What happens when states, not strategists in a simulation, begin pulling the levers of financial aggression? Because that's where the story turns from simulation to confrontation, from warnings to history, and from caution to action. Chapter 5, Currency War II, 1967 to 1987. Imagine waking up one morning to a world that doesn't revolve around the US dollar anymore. You reach for your phone and scroll through the news. China and Russia agree to ditch dollar in bilateral trade. The headlines keep stacking. Saudi Arabia accepts yuan for oil payments. BRICS nations form new reserve currency. You pause, brows furrowed, not entirely grasping the ripple effect these headlines carry. But something feels off. Something monumental is shifting. Now ask yourself, what happens when the dollar is no longer king? And what if this dethroning wasn't sudden, but the result of a carefully crafted strategy decades in the making? This is where Chapter 5 of Currency Wars begins. Not with an explosion or a missile, but with a quiet, calculated maneuver. One that has the potential to destabilize global finance as we know it. We're no longer talking about simulations or Pentagon games. This chapter brings us face to face with a real-world challenger, China, a nation that isn't launching jets or building tanks to FI the next war. Instead, it's hoarding gold, launching global infrastructure projects, and slowly pushing its currency, the yuan, into the global spotlight. James Rickards opens this chapter with a deceptively simple yet weighty idea that money, when wielded with patience and precision, can be a weapon more powerful than any arsenal. But unlike conventional weapons, its damage is not immediate. It erodes, it disorients. It quietly rearranges the pillars of power. So, how exactly did China get here? How did a nation once riddled with poverty and foreign debt become one of America's most potent financial rivals? To understand this transformation, Rickards takes us back to the 1970s, when China was barely emerging from the shadows of the Cultural Revolution. The country was closed off, economically backward, and ideologically rigid. But then, something changed. Deng Xiaoping stepped onto stage with a revolutionary idea. It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice. In one stroke, Deng opened China's doors to capitalism, at least in the form China would define. And with that, the country began its decades-long sprint toward becoming the world's factory, financier, and most importantly, a future financial superpower. But let's pause for a moment here, because this wasn't just about economic growth. China didn't just want wealth. It wanted resilience, independence, a place at the global table on its own terms. And it realized very early that whoever controls a currency controls the rules. Here's where the idea becomes sobering. The dollar's dominance is not just a matter of convenience. It's a tool of U.S. power. It allows America to impose sanctions, control global liquidity, and finance its deficits with impunity. China knew this. It watched as other nations, like Iran, North Korea, even Russia, got squeezed not with bombs, but with dollars. And so it began to act. China started accumulating U.S. treasuries, but not out of admiration, more like strategy, like someone who's trying to study every move of an opponent before making their own. For years, it kept buying, becoming America's largest creditor. And then, it began something even more telling. It started stockpiling gold. Yes, gold, the very asset many economists in the West had long dismissed as outdated. While financial elites were busy mocking gold bugs, China was quietly buying tons of the metal, often through secretive off-market channels to avoid spooking global markets. It wasn't trying to make a profit. It was building a shield. A golden firewall. Why? Because China understood something most people ignore. When trust in fiat currencies erodes, when inflation rises, or when political tensions spike, gold doesn't blink. It doesn't default. It doesn't need a central bank's promise. It just is. Now pair this with the rise of the yuan. At first, China's currency was seen as a mere side note, tightly controlled, pegged to the dollar, and untradeable outside its borders. But then, piece by piece, China began internationalizing the yuan. It created swap lines with central banks. It formed offshore clearing banks in London, Singapore, and Frankfurt. It got the IMF to include the yuan in the elite basket of reserve currencies. the SDR. And slowly, the question began to emerge. Is the yuan being groomed to challenge the dollar? Rickards doesn't present this as mere speculation. He frames it as an unfolding narrative, a story that's still being written. And what makes it even more compelling is the subtlety of China's approach. It's not about confrontation. It's about co-option. Consider the Belt and Road Initiative. Ostensibly, it's about infrastructure, ports, railways, energy pipelines. But underneath, it's about leverage. Many of these projects are funded in yuan. Some involve long-term repayment plans that tie countries more closely to China's orbit. In other words, it's not just roads and bridges. It's influence, currency influence. So let's come back to the big questions that frame this chapter. What happens if the dollar loses its grip? Could another nation, without firing a single bullet, undermine U.S. power through the slow weaponization of money? And are we already too late in recognizing the signs? Rickards suggests we might be. He doesn't paint a picture of imminent collapse, but rather of dangerous complacency. While America spends its political capital fighting over domestic issues, China is playing a long game, one that doesn't make headlines but changes the world. It's not just about economic competition anymore. It's about monetary sovereignty, about who sets the rules when the next crisis hits, about who gets to print and who has to beg. And this, Rickards argues, is the ultimate currency war, one that doesn't look like war at all. In this section, he urges us to rethink our assumptions, to realize that power in the 21st century may not come from aircraft carriers or stealth bombers, but from control of capital flows, reserves, and trust. If that sounds abstract, think of it this way. In a digital, interconnected world, money is like oxygen. You don't notice it when it's there. But when it's pulled away, through sanctions, devaluation, or market freezes, life stops. Economies choke. Governments fall. And China, it seems, is preparing for that moment. Not to choke, but to breathe freely, on its own terms. So here's where this chapter leaves us. Not with answers, but with a new lens. A lens that forces us to view China not just as an economic juggernaut, but as a strategic currency combatant. One that plays with patience, resilience, and vision. One that understands that real wars aren't always fought with troops, but with trust and the gradual erosion of it. And maybe that's the most dangerous war of all. Let's now pull back the curtain a little further. If you thought the story of America's dominance in the world was written solely in battles won and industries built, then you're only reading half the plot. There's a quieter war, one without bullets or bombs, that has shaped modern empires just as powerfully. It's fought in the minds of economists across the digital trading effluence of New York and London, and whispered in late-night phone calls between central bankers. And at the center of it all, the dollar. You see, the dollar didn't simply become the world's reserve currency. It wasn't ordained from the heavens. It emerged from a series of choices, some brilliant, some desperate, and many hidden behind the closed doors of power. But like any dominant force, the dollar also created enemies. And now, those enemies are pushing back, not with tanks, but with bonds, gold, and currency swaps. So let's go back. Picture the early 1970s, post-Bretton Woods. Nixon had just taken the U.S. off the gold standard, effectively decoupling the dollar from any hard asset. For centuries, money was tangible. Gold had weight. Silver had shine. But now money was belief. Floating exchange rates became the norm. Trust became the only anchor. That moment changed everything. Without gold backing it, the dollar was suddenly just paper, albeit paper backed by a powerful military and deep financial markets. But the implications were deeper than most realized. Once the dollar was unmoored from gold, America could print as much as it wanted. Wars? Stimulus? Bailouts? No problem. Just fire up the presses, or later, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. In theory, the U.S. could spend infinitely. And for a while, that worked. The world, especially oil-exporting nations, still used dollars. Global trade was settled in dollars. Even when countries didn't like American politics, they still held their noses and held the greenback. But behind the scenes, the foundations were shifting. Nations like China, Russia, and even U.S. allies like France began quietly questioning, why should we be at the mercy of American money printing? Why should we suffer when the Fed decides to inflate away its debt? And so, bit by bit, they began to look for ways to escape, to reduce their exposure, to create alternatives. And that's where this quiet war took shape. Take China, for example. They didn't confront the dollar head-on. That would be suicide. Instead, they played the long game, slowly accumulating gold reserves, establishing bilateral currency deals with trading partners, and even creating their own financial institutions like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIB, to rival the IMF and World Bank. They began pricing some oil trades in yuan. They launched the petyuan. These moves might seem small individually, but they're strategic. Death by 1,000 cuts. Russia followed suit, especially after the 2014 Crimea sanctions. It began dumping dollar assets and hoarding gold at an accelerated pace. They knew that the dollar wasn't just a currency. It was a weapon, and America had shown it was willing to use it. Cutting Russian banks out of the SWIFT system, that wasn't just a slap on the wrist. That was a chokehold. So Russia responded, not by fighting back with missiles, but by re-engineering its economy to reduce dollar dependence. Even in Europe, discontent simmered. France's President Charles de Gaulle once demanded that the U.S. convert its dollar reserves into gold, triggering a monetary crisis. Decades later, the sentiment still echoes. Why should America get the exorbitant privilege of printing the world's money while everyone else had to play by the rules? It's important to understand that these aren't just policy disagreements. They're symptoms of a broader reality. The dollar, once seen as a beacon of stability, was now seen by many as a tool of coercion. Now, let's zoom into the mechanics. How does this financial warfare actually work in practice? Start with the U.S. itself. When the Fed prints money, it weakens the dollar relative to other currencies. That makes American exports cheaper, boosting U.S. companies. But it also causes inflation abroad, particularly in emerging markets that depend on dollar trade. This is no small thing. If you're a country like Brazil, India, or South Africa, and the dollar surges or sinks suddenly, your entire economy can wobble. That's power. Now imagine you're China, sitting on over $1 trillion in U.S. debt. On one hand, those treasury bonds give you leverage, but on the other, they tie you to the dollar's fate. If the U.S. inflates the dollar, your holdings lose value. It's a strange marriage of distrust and dependence. You want out, but breaking up could hurt you just as much. This delicate dance is where the shadow war lies. Nations can use monetary policy as a kind of strategic pressure. Devalue your currency to stimulate exports. Suddenly your neighbor can't compete. Raise interest rates to attract foreign capital. Now their currency drops and inflation spikes. Hoard gold and issue gold-backed bonds. Suddenly investors rethink their dollar loyalty. These moves aren't random. They're calculated. Rickards describes it well. Financial war isn't about crashing stock markets overnight. It's about slow, systematic disruptions. Imagine hacking the bloodstream of the global economy. You don't kill the body outright. You clog the arteries. You trigger strokes. You stress the heart. And all the while, your opponent doesn't even realize they're under attack until it's too late. And here's the eerie part. These tactics aren't science fiction. They're happening now. In the 2000s, the Fed's loose monetary policy after the dot-com crash inflated a global credit bubble. That bubble burst in 2008. Afterward, instead of tightening, the Fed doubled down with zero interest rates and quantitative easing. The dollar weakened. Other countries, especially in Asia, were forced to follow suit or suffer currency appreciation. It became a race to the bottom. This was a de facto currency war, not declared, not televised, but very real. And then there's gold. Gold has always been the enemy of fiat money. It can't be printed. It can't be manipulated easily. So when nations like China and Russia start stockpiling gold, it's not just about diversification. It's a message. We're preparing for a world after the dollar. Some analysts scoff, but others see the writing on the wall. A potential future where trade settles in gold-backed digital currencies, where the dollar is just one of many players, not the king. That's the lesson buried beneath the headlines. Financial power is no longer about who has the biggest stockpile of nukes. It's about who controls the levers of trust and liquidity, who can cause panic in markets with a single statement, who can drain your economy without ever crossing your borders. And perhaps most chilling of all, it's about who can rewrite the rules of money itself. So where does this leave us? It leaves us staring at a world in transition. One where the dollar supremacy isn't gone, but it's contested. One where trust in U.S. monetary policy is no longer unconditional. And one where America's greatest strength, its ability to print the world's currency, may one day become its Achilles heel. Because in the end, all fiat money is a confidence game. And confidence, once lost, is almost impossible to regain. As Rickards warns, we're living in a precarious equilibrium. The dollar's dominance rests on a shaky foundation of habit, inertia, and perceived stability. But if enough nations decide to opt out, if the alternatives become even slightly more attractive, that entire system could unravel faster than anyone expects. The real war, it turns out, isn't coming. It's already here. And most of us don't even know we're fighting it. So, what exactly did the financial war game teach us? Was it just a quirky exercise with toy money and role-play scenarios played out in a secure room? Or was it a wake-up call for the global order? The truth lies somewhere deeper, buried in the surprising insights that emerged from the simulation, and, more importantly, in what those insights reveal about the very nature of modern power. The game may have ended in that quiet command center, but the consequences have rippled outward like tremors before a quake. At first glance, the lessons from the simulation seem simple. Financial systems are vulnerable, economic tools can be weaponized, and the United States is not immune to being destabilized. But when the Pentagon team began to truly digest what had happened, a darker realization crept in. The tools of war had changed, not in the future, but already. The battlefield had moved from deserts and airspace to stock markets and central banks. And worse, many of the people in charge of protecting national interests had no idea how to fight in this new arena. One of the key insights to emerge was just how easy it was for adversaries to exploit the global system's interconnectedness. The players didn't need bombs or bullets. They used seemingly benign instruments, currency devaluation, targeted investments, foreign asset dumping. These aren't acts of war in the traditional sense. They don't make headlines or rattle windows, but their impact can be more devastating. They can bankrupt companies, crash economies, and plunge nations into chaos. Quietly, Rickards described it best. Money had become more dangerous than missiles. Because while a missile takes down a building, a well-timed financial strike can take down an entire economy, and no one sees it coming. This was a hard truth for many at the Pentagon to swallow. The war game participants were brilliant minds, economists, intelligence analysts, military officers, but even they had underestimated how quickly the tide could turn. The United States had long assumed a position of dominance in global finance. The dollar was a reserve currency, Wall Street was a capital of capitalism, and the Federal Reserve was a de facto global central bank. But during the simulation, when opposing teams manipulated markets, launched currency attacks, and dumped dollar-denominated assets, the illusion of safety cracked. Complacency, it turned out, was the real threat. The U.S. system had become so dependent on its status that it failed to consider its own vulnerabilities. It assumed that no one would dare challenge the dollar. But the simulation showed that not only could it be challenged, it could be crippled and fast. This led to another uncomfortable revelation. Financial warfare didn't require symmetrical power. A smaller country, or even a non-state actor with deep pockets or strategic alliance, could wreak havoc through tools like sovereign wealth funds, gold reserves, or cyber financial hacking. They could initiate moves that would have cascading effects on global markets. It was like watching someone insert a small but sharp stone into the gears of a giant machine. That machine, the global economy, might seem unstoppable, but under stress, it could seize up entirely. And once the flow of credit and trust stopped, everything stopped. Rickards emphasized that this wasn't theory anymore. These weren't abstract ideas confined to the pages of a think tank report. This was reality. One playing out behind the scenes in boardrooms, policy circles, and back-channel diplomatic talks. The financial war game wasn't prediction. It was a warning. The emotional tone that followed was one of unease. Many of the Pentagon officials left the simulation deeply unsettled. They weren't just dealing with hypotheticals. They were staring into the future and seeing how unprepared they truly were. Rickards himself recalled how, after game, there was no celebratory debrief or triumphant analysis. Instead, there was silence. An eerie quiet, participants filed out, heads down, processing the scale of what they'd just seen. It was a feeling not unlike the moments after a real battlefield exercise, where the adrenaline fades, and you're left with the cold realization of just how close things can come to collapse. But perhaps the most powerful takeaway from the simulation was this. Traditional defenses mean little in a financial war. You can have the best military, the most advanced missiles, the largest fleet, and still lose, because your economy is your soft underbelly. And when your enemy doesn't wear a uniform, doesn't fire a weapon, and doesn't even need to cross a border, how you defend yourself? Rickards warned that we were already seeing the early stages of real-world financial conflict. China's strategic accumulation of gold, Russia's de-dollarization efforts, even America's own use of financial sanctions. All of these were signs of currency wars in action. These weren't hypothetical moves. They were chess pieces already in play. And the terrifying part? Most people weren't paying attention. The media focused on interest rates and stock prices. Politicians bickered over budgets and bailouts. But behind the curtain, nations were maneuvering for financial supremacy in ways that could determine the fate of the next global order. So what does this all mean going forward? It means we need to rethink the very idea of war. It's no longer just about tanks and troops. It's about trade policy, currency reserves, debt levels, and digital infrastructures. It's about understanding that economic decisions, like printing money or sanctioning rivals, aren't just financial strategies. They are acts of aggression, sometimes acts of war. And it means that everyday people, investors, retirees, small business owners, are on the front lines, whether they realize it or not. Because when a financial system collapses, it's not just the rich who suffer. It's the average worker who loses their job, the family who loses their savings, the retiree whose pension evaporates. Rickards doesn't end this chapter with a neat solution. He's not trying to offer comfort. Instead, he offers clarity. He wants the reader to wake up, to see that the rules have changed, and that in this new game, the stakes are existential. The chapter closes by hinting at what's to come. If the war game showed us what could happen, the next chapters will show us what has happened. The simulation wasn't just a drill, it was a preview, because the currency wars weren't coming. They were already here. This realization, the shift from theory to reality, is where the true urgency begins. The next steps, Rickards suggests, involve understanding the players, the strategies, and the real-world battles already underway. Because if we continue to view money as merely a medium of exchange and not as a weapon, we will lose wars we don't even realize we're fighting. And in that loss, nations won't just lose currency value. They could lose sovereignty, stability, and the trust that underpins everything in modern life. This isn't paranoia, it's preparation. And in a world of silent battles and invisible enemies, awareness may be the only real defense we have left. So now that we've walked through the turbulent history of devaluations, seen the gold drain of the 1960s, Nixon's shock, and the haunting echoes of the Great Depression, you may be wondering, what does all of it really mean for today? How does it tie into the world we're living in now, where money moves at the speed of light, currencies float freely, and central banks play God with interest rates? Are we just repeating old mistakes on a digital stage? Or is something even more dangerous brewing beneath the surface? Here's the thing. What Rickards has carefully built in this chapter is not just a historical tour. It's a warning, a flashing red light, a jigsaw puzzle where each piece connects to the next, pointing us an uncomfortable truth. The mechanics of modern finance are not only fragile, they're global, weaponized, and deeply misunderstood. And that misunderstanding could be the catalyst for the next great economic catastrophe. Let's pull back and connect the dots. The 1930s showed us what happens when countries retreat into economic nationalism. When fear sets in, the first reaction is often protect one's own turf. Tariffs go up, currencies get devalued, and borders, financial or literal, start to harden. That's exactly what led to the global trade collapse back then, intensifying the Great Depression. Now think about our present world. Sure, we have more technology, more global trade, and more interconnectedness. But we also have the same instincts and the same tools. Currency devaluation is still a go-to strategy, especially during crises. And unlike in the past, the stakes today are planetary. So, what happens if multiple countries start devaluing at once? That's not a hypothetical anymore. It's already happening. Rickards calls it a race to the bottom. When one country devalues, others feel compelled to follow suit. Otherwise, their exports become too expensive and their economies suffer. But when everyone's cutting the value of their currency simultaneously, no one actually gains. It's a zero-sum game. Worse, it can lead to massive capital flight, inflationary surges, and ultimately, a collapse of trust in fiat currencies. Now consider this. Fiat money, the kind we use now, is not backed by gold or any tangible commodity. It's backed by trust, confidence in governments, in central banks, in the system itself. But trust is fragile. It takes years to build and moments to break. And what Rickards is suggesting quite powerfully is that global trust is already under assault. When the U.S. decided to end gold convertibility in 1971, it unleashed an era of pure fiat currency, untethered from any real anchor, that made monetary manipulation easier, but also riskier. Central banks could print at will, adjust rates on a whim, and respond to crises with quantitative easing or bailouts. But each of these tools chips away at the underlying stability of the system. Eventually, the world starts asking, how much is a dollar really worth if trillions can be printed overnight? And this brings us to an even larger point. Currency wars are no longer just economic. They're geopolitical. In the Cold War, it was missiles, nukes, and military strategy. Today, it's capital flows, trade deficits, and currency manipulation. The battlefield has shifted, but the intent remains: to gain power, weaken adversaries, and control the global balance. As Rickards makes clear, a country doesn't need to fire a shot to bring another to its knees. It can just target its currency. Now pause and think about what that means in a world where China is hoarding gold, Russia is de-dollarizing, and emerging markets are looking for alternatives to the U.S.-led system. This isn't random. It's a response to decades of dollar dominance and monetary policy that, intentionally or not, hurts other nations. For countries like China, holding trillions in U.S. debt is both a blessing and a curse. If the dollar loses value, so does their investment. But if they sell off too quickly, they could trigger a collapse. It's like holding a ticking bomb. You need it to survive, but it could blow up in your face at any time. Rickards also hints at the idea of a new global monetary order, possibly led by the International Monetary Fund, IMF, using special drawing rights, SDRs, as a synthetic reserve currency. This may sound futuristic, but it's already being tested. The logic is simple. If the dollar is unstable and gold is too rigid for modern economies, then a basket of currencies might provide the needed balance. But even that solution comes with its own set of risks, chief among them being governance, transparency, and political manipulation. So where does this leave us? It leaves us at the edge of a precipice, staring down at a system that's become increasingly volatile, increasingly weaponized, and dangerously misunderstood. Financial markets are not neutral arenas. They are extensions of national power, capable of destruction just as much as creation. Rickards wants us to understand this, not just intellectually, but emotionally. He wants us to feel the urgency, the fragility, and the stakes involved. Because if we continue to treat money like just another tool of convenience, we may sleepwalk into the next great global crisis. And here's perhaps the most sobering realization. We've seen this movie before. In the 1930s, in the 1970s, and again in 2008. Each time, we responded with short-term fixes, political spin, and economic jargon. But each time, the underlying vulnerabilities have grown worse. Devaluation isn't a solution, it's a symptom, a sign that deeper problems remain unsolved. Now, as we stand in this fragile moment in history, Rickards invites us to look beyond the headlines, beyond the inflation reports, the interest rate chatter, the market noise. He wants us to ask bigger questions. Who really controls the value of our money? What happens when trust in the system breaks? Are we prepared for a world where financial warfare becomes a primary mode of global conflict? These aren't just philosophical musings. They're the opening notes of a very real symphony that's already begun to play. And so, as this chapter closes, the transition to what comes next is seamless but ominous. If Chapter 5 helped us understand the playbook of financial warfare, then the next chapter will begin to show us the battlefield itself. Because currency wars are not theoretical. They're not confined to textbooks or war games. They're already happening, right now, in slow motion, all around us. And the question that lingers in the air, soft but persistent, is this. If we're already in a financial war, who's winning? And who doesn't even know they're fighting?